Seeking Level. Chapter 13. There's no real way to keep internal time on a spaceship. No way to tell without the external clues of regular orbit and gravity how minutes and hours pass. When Keith opened his eyes again, the lights lit the room at the same level as they had when he'd gone to sleep. The only way he knew that time must have passed was because he was suddenly alert and feeling well rested, and someone was knocking on the door. Keith looked down the length of the mattress, relieved to find Lance still with him, lifting his head curiously to the sound that had woken them both. "Keith?" Hunk summoned from the other side. "You awake?" Keith exchanged a quick look with Lance as the door opened, hoping he was okay with being discovered in bed with him, because there wasn't any time to stop that from happening. But Lance just shrugged, grinning. Yeah. Yeah. Keith cleared the sleep from his throat. "Yeah, Hunk, come in." "Do you have any idea where Lance went?" Hunk asked, looking over his shoulder down the hallway as he entered. "I can't find him anywhere." He cut off as he turned to see them together, his mouth going too slack for speech. Then he pulled both fists up to his chest, eyes sparkling. "Aww," he gushed good-humoredly, drawing out the word too long to not make it awkward. Keith sat up as Lance butted his face against his chest shyly. "Yes!" "Hey, Hunk," Lance greeted as the big man came over to tussle both of their heads. "I told you," Hunk triumphed, pointing finger guns at Lance. "And I should have told you a lot sooner." More finger guns, Keith's direction. "And I've got to tell Pidge. She owes me money." Disjointed nonsense way faster than Keith. No," Hunk said, unconvincingly. "Doesn't matter. Good for you." "Thanks," Lance said, blushing, while Keith asked, "Something going on?" "Oh, yeah." Hunk changed direction again, remembering why he'd come to get Keith in the first place. "I came to see if you were awake and could come to the bridge." "Everything okay?" Lance asked, moving to stand up, with Keith following. "It's great. Pidge just did something clever and couldn't wait any more to tell everyone about it," Hunk explained, making Keith and Lance look at each other sideways. "We're coming," Lance promised. Hunk nodded, stepping backward before changing his mind and grabbing them both in a tight hug. "Aww," he said again, pinching their cheeks for good measure before leading the way to the bridge. Keith took Lance's wrist possessively and followed, his pulse a comforting pace against his fingertips. They took bets? Keith echoed, overwhelmed with so much in such a short time frame. Lance looked slightly ashamed, walking by Keith's side. "Everybody knew about you and me, except you and me?" "Apparently I am dramatic," Lance muttered, then quickly changed the subject. "So, Hunk, what's Pidge done?" "Nope, not stealing her thunder," Hunk denied, holding up a hand like a physical barrier of information. "I choose life, especially since I made her wait over a Varga before I would let anyone wake Keith up." "Maybe I should have let you go longer?" he hinted, looking over his shoulder at them. "I don't think relationships have time limits, Hunk," Keith told him flatly, hearing Lance choke near his ear as he said it. He was surprised how much he liked that. Saying it out loud, starting a relationship, making Lance blush. Something he'd thought would make him feel trapped and frightened was actually secure and comforting. He'd found Shiro, who had stepped into his life as a mentor and something like an older brother, and he would be forever loyal and love him for that. But what he felt for Lance was different. Not necessarily stronger. It was hard to determine. He thought again of Red and his bond with her. There were so many kinds of love surrounding him, and here he'd thought he would live the rest of his life without any of it. "Hunk! Good! There you are!" Pidge greeted as they all came trooping into the bridge, looking extremely excited about whatever it was that she'd figured out. "Lance, where were you?" "Busy," Lance said, twisting his wrist out of Keith's grasp. For a second Keith worried about that, until he caught the look in Lance's eye and understood that what they had to say was just as special as what Pidge was going to tell them, and Lance wanted it to have its own moment, which definitely could not happen until Pidge had spoken first. He nodded slightly to acknowledge the plan, and watched relief and happiness. But come here, check this out. Pidge gestured hurriedly, missing the entire exchange, coming to Lance's side to physically pull him over to her workstation where everyone else was already standing. Keith, you too. All right, Keith? Shiro asked from his own position near Pidge's area. He stood at semi-attention, arms folded, expression indicating that he had not missed anything. You slept a long time. Forever, Pidge agreed in a huff. I'm great, Keith said dismissively. What'd I miss? Okay, Pidge began, unable to wait any longer. So I took Keith's beetle and did some testing on it. That's when Keith saw the clear receptacle that Pidge used for the insect sitting in front of her. It was in there, completely still for the moment, all its legs extended out from its body. Keith swallowed hard looking at it, completely grossed out. He still couldn't believe that thing had come out of his... Shiro kept his eyes on Keith instead of the beetle. He could feel it without looking, though they were several feet apart. We thought that it must have animated from the dust of the planet, remember? Using Keith's quintessence to come back to life. It's actually a pretty effective defense mechanism, especially from the Galra. Watch, if you try to extricate the quintessence... How would you even do that? Lance broke in, watching intently. Let me show you, Pidge said, which is what she normally said when the process would take too long to explain, and she was sure that no one in the room would get it anyway. Keith watched, but he still didn't get it. Pidge screwed the container into some kind of port that she'd apparently put together herself. I made a scale but functional model of the tech the Galra use for mining quintessence from planets, based on the machines we saw on the Balmera, she said as she worked, hooking up wires and tweaking knobs, her tone, as always, too casual for the accomplishment. Like anyone could have done it. Keith swallowed again as the beetle started to stir inside the glass. He found it hard to look at it. He shifted, leaning a little until his arm was touching Lance's, getting a little relief when Lance leaned back. As Pidge turned a dial, the atmosphere in the container seemed to darken. The bug sped up its movement, as if seeking escape. The image of Malea's soul in Red's cockpit begging for energy filled Keith's memory. Don't, he heard himself say, finding it almost unbearable to watch the demonstration. Everyone turned wondering eyes on him, making him even more uncomfortable. You're killing it. No, it's okay, Keith, Pidge assured him, but he wondered how she could know that. She wasn't under the jar. She wasn't having her quintessence drained from her. The warmth of the bridge was being sucked into that jar. He could feel it. Keith's body remembered his own quintessence being across the desk. He took what he hoped would be a steadying breath. Look, Pidge drew his attention. It has a trick. Lance's hand found Keith's, squeezing it slightly, as Pidge continued to turn up the dial. The bug shuddered at the bottom of the glass, and then suddenly exploded into dust motes. They struck all sides of the receptacle with tiny ping sounds, and then settled into a little pile, all the dust he'd gathered into his lungs while breathing on the planet. There was a rather disturbing amount. Keith pressed the hand that wasn't holding Lance's against his chest, swallowing again. Pidge? Lance asked gently, side-eyeing Keith in concern. How's that okay? You completely fried it. No, nothing like that, Pidge denied, shaking her head, slightly frustrated that they weren't getting it. It's like that soldier told us. This prevents quintessence being taken. The beetle's fine, inside out. Wrapped all its quintessence inside a protective barrier. Like a spore. Looks dead, Pidge, Hunk told her, unconvinced. That's the best part, Pidge said, sounding giddy. It's completely reversible. There's no energy lost here, just contained. That's what Red had said, Keith remembered. Dormant life. All these particles, every one, still has the blueprint of the beetle in it. It's absolutely perfect. It just needs a catalyst to reverse the process. The whole planet can go back exactly how it was before the Galra ever touched it. But the energy required to do that is massive, Allura said, doubtful, frowning next to Shiro. Keith nodded agreement. More than any of us could produce, or even all of us together. But we don't have to, Pidge countered, smiling slyly. The energy is already, but we don't have to, Pidge countered, smiling slyly. The energy is already present. She looked around at her waiting audience, gauging if they were ready for what she was about to tell them. Keith also checked everyone, glad to see they all looked as confused as he felt. He was starting to feel apprehensive. They were still talking about Malaya, still trying to find a way to save it. When were they going to let it go, that it was a lost cause? He wanted to put it out of his mind, never touch on it again. Hunk, how does popcorn work? Pidge asked suddenly. He looked at her like she'd lost her mind, before understanding bloomed in his face. Oh, he drawled, grating on Keith, who had no idea how popcorn worked. Like that. Because of the liquid. Right. Vindicated, Pidge launched into an explanation, her hands flying around her machine as she talked, dials replacing the wires with different apparatus. Keith tried to keep up, but he only really heard some key words, something about dormant and kinetic energy, and the starch of the popcorn that allowed it to do the actual popping part, more stuff about liquid and how it's present in all things, and then another analogy to falling dominoes. It made his head feel somewhat cloudy. His throat itched. So all we really need, Pidge concluded, flipping a switch, is heat. Immediately light began to brighten the glass jar, and the dust began to vibrate, glowing red, an artificial substitute for whatever had happened inside of Keith's body the first time the beetle had done this. It was making him dizzy. He cleared his throat, unconsciously breathing faster, eyes fixed to the pile of dust. It was almost boiling. The red increased to white. Lance instinctively leaned away in anticipation of what might happen as the pressure rose. Keith fought the urge to put his hand in front of his face. The dust solidified in front of them, melted together, and then cracked audibly, peeling away as the same damn beetle emerged from it, unchanged, the remaining dust drawn almost magnetically to the shiny exoskeleton, merging flawlessly into it as the reaction finished. Pidge quickly turned down her heat source, waving her hand over the scene as if she'd just done a magic trick. "Isn't it just gorgeous?" she asked. That was definitely not the word Keith would have picked. Unsettling, sure. Weird. Unnatural. He couldn't find a positive word for this. He was doing his best not to pant. No wonder he'd hurt so much. He was kind of surprised his whole lung hadn't burst open. Or maybe it had. No one had actually told him the damage report. Lance shifted closer to him, sensing his unease. Astonishing, Alora christened it, voice hopeful. So there is something we can do for this planet after all. No, Keith groaned, too soft for anyone but Lance to hear him. He felt like his throat was tightening up. Keith? Lance whispered, keeping his hand but also turning to put the other one on Keith's shoulder blade. You okay? The others were too caught up in what had happened to notice. But how would we get enough heat? Shiro asked, hand on his chin, pondering the scene. We'll need more than heat, Pidge instructed, stroking the side of the jar, apparently cool to the touch. It's not the same as pyrophytic germination. If it were that easy, we could just set the whole planet on fire. What a good idea, Keith thought darkly, struggling to stand still and keep quiet. We need water, too, Pidge continued, as a buffer, so it'll heat gradually. But we don't need to cover the whole planet. I figure if we start in turns to set off a sort of chain reaction. See, the first organisms will pop, releasing energy, and then that energy will trigger more reactions and expand as it moves outward, spreading in a ripple effect. We'd only need enough to get the process started, and then it should complete on its own. It's certainly worth a try, Alora agreed thoughtfully. Keith's chest felt hot now, despite the chill on his skin, nerves starting to spark, some of his muscles weakening. They were not talking about this, were they? Not really. It sounded like they were planning on returning. Going underground? Had they learned nothing? Statistically, the success rate is high, Pidge calculated. We'll just send the Blue Lion first to lay down some water, and then Keith can follow in red for the heat. And then popcorn, Hunk said, nodding. Are you crazy? Keith demanded suddenly, the question exploding out of him as violent as the reaction they'd just watched. It really should work, Pidge began, but Keith wasn't interested in hearing the physics again. No, he protested, knowing he was coming off manic and knowing he'd be better received if he toned it down, but he was past the place where he could have done that. I'm not doing it. He turned intensely to Lance. And you're not either. No way. Pidge, it stole the green lion from you. Did you forget that? Allura almost died getting her back. I almost died. Lance was so close. Calm down, Keith, Pidge told him. None of the lions are going to touch down. It should only take a couple of... No, Keith yelled again. His whole body stiffened, and he stepped away from Lance, shaking his head, shaking him off. Overreacting. Keith, Lance said his name as soothingly as he'd ever heard it said, but he put his hands up, blocking it out. Hey, he'd ever heard it said, but he put his hands up, blocking it out. Hey. He'd gone along with all of their suggestions against his better judgment, and he had lost count of how many times it had almost killed him. He wasn't doing it again, was certainly not risking Lance for it. Lance's eyes held fear and worry now, but he obediently kept his hands off. Think of the planet. It's people, Allura's voice reminded him of their earlier conversation, filtered into the space where Keith and Lance were staring at each other. But Keith's loyalty was to no planet. He wasn't going to trust her to assess the risk in this. She didn't have enough skin in this game, and Keith suddenly had so much he didn't want to lose. And to send Lance in first? Out of the question. You can't save them all, he spat at the princess. Let's just get out of here, he said to no one and everyone, turning away. Keith, wait. He wasn't sure who called him back, but he wasn't running. Away from the bridge, away from that horrible machine Pidge had made, away from that disgusting beetle that gave him the creeps, away from Lance. He sprinted, as he used to do when he felt trapped, out of control. No thought of a destination other than far from whatever had made him feel too much. Sometimes, when he was younger, he'd run until his strength gave out on him, never even lifting his head to see where he was going until he'd collapsed, breathless and shaky, and not knowing where he was. Most of the time, he stayed where he'd dropped, knowing if he moved, the temporary numbness would stop. Every time, someone would find him and bring him back to where they thought he was supposed to be, back where his problems started, in an endless, painful loop, and he would run again. But as vast as the Castle of Lions was, there were only so many places he could run. Red's presence drew him, without even him thinking about her or where he was going. He cried, getting a slight sense of relief from the force of the contact, and then dropped onto the floor, his palm flat against her side. Light bloomed into his brain as his unexpected violence woke her up, and he felt her mentally gasp in surprise, even as she wrapped his consciousness in her might, the first warmth he'd felt since he saw the beetle on the bridge. He didn't speak, grateful that she wouldn't need him to, but his soul begged for her to tip her head, let him in. Let's get out of here. Let's fly. He didn't care where. He just needed the movement, needed her speed because his wasn't enough. But she did not move. Her hesitation in accepting his chaos felt like a betrayal. Be still, she commanded, steadfast and immovable and way too calm. She didn't understand, had no way to know what conversation he'd just left, what they were planning to make him do. There is no danger here, she maintained. He knew that. He knew that. But there was still danger here, she maintained. He knew that. He knew that. But there was still danger. Outside, below the dead surface, waiting. They wanted Lance to go in there first. Keith? Keith let his head fall, caught, guilty, overreacting. He'd run as far as he could reach, and as usual, Shiro had come to collect him, take him back to the beginning. Let's start over. Another chance. I'm not doing it, Shiro, he said preemptively, not looking up. He felt Shiro join him almost the same way he felt Red in his heart, a presence that didn't need to be seen. No one can force you, Shiro soothed, but only halfway. Keith knew why he was here. He knew all the words that had been said as soon as he'd left the bridge. What happened? Where'd he go? Let me talk to him. I can calm him down." Well, calm and cooperative were not the same thing. And no. Okay, Shiro agreed firmly. "I didn't come here to convince you." "Then what are you doing here?" Keith asked, not believing, harsher than he meant to sound. It wasn't the first time he'd struck out at Shiro for something he hadn't done. "Keith," Shiro said, hurt, taking a small step backward. "I'm worried about you. It's been a long time since you've done this. I just want to help. Let me know what's going on with you." "Nothing's going on. The planet is just bad, Shiro. There's nothing good on it or near it, and every time we get close to it, someone almost dies. I think we should quit while we're ahead. It's too dangerous." "It's dying," Shiro corrected gently. "It's doing all it can to survive. And this time, for this planet, there's actually a chance for recovery. Look, I get it. No one suffered more than you have for this mission, but I've seen you push through worse. What's different this time?" "Not sure if you saw the beetle that came out of my chest," Keith started sarcastically, but shut his mouth as Shiro crouched down next to him on the floor, putting his hand on his shoulder and finally catching his eyes. "No, I saw," he said, terribly serious, as if he'd shared the pain. "I saw all of it." And Keith heard what he wasn't saying. He wilted against Shiro's hand. "I can't watch Lance go underground again," he confessed. "I can't. I don't have it in me to go after him. And I don't have it in me to lose him. It had been so hard the first time. The nerve to jump had been the easy part compared to what had come after. Lance's unfocused eyes, his lapses in memory, the blood on his face, that sound. It had been so awful, and he hadn't even understood what it meant to him then. To have to do it over now that he understood how much he cared? What if something happened? What if he failed? "So it is about Lance," Shiro repeated, as if confirming his own musings. "Keith, you know he's still a paladin, right? There will be risks." "But not this one," Keith denied, closed tight. He did not want to hear this. He'd just have to work harder, that's all. Do better. Protect what mattered to him most. But not there. Not again. "That's Lance's decision. You're going to have to believe in him. Trust his ability. He'll feel it if you don't, and you can't live in that place and stay together." "You don't understand," Keith started, but didn't know how he could explain it in a way where anyone could ever. Shiro tightened his hold on Keith's shoulder, shaking him slightly. "You don't think so?" he challenged, and there was a hardness in him that surprised Keith. "Keith, your radio for over 3 hours. 3 hours where I couldn't hear you, followed by 40 where I couldn't get to you. And then you came back broken and sick and angry, but not because I saved you. You saved yourself, and you came back different. You don't think that bothered me? You don't think that terrified me? And then we went back, and I watched the ground swallow you whole, and I still don't know what happened to you while you were down there because it's so horrible you can't even talk about it. But I know it did something to you. And again you had to save yourself, and again you came back sick and broken and angry." "Shiro," Keith interjected, ready for this to end. He hadn't even thought about what his actions could have done to him. Had never suspected it would be like this. He hadn't known how much Shiro worried for him. "And you wouldn't let me help you," Shiro continued, as if he needed to get it out of his system despite how it was making Keith's insides twist. "I knew I should have put you in a healing pod that last time. I knew there was something wrong. But I didn't. I let you make your own choices. And then I had to run to Lance's room where you were on the floor, lying in blood. Your lips were blue, Keith. You were barely breathing. That thing tore you apart inside, and I couldn't do anything to stop it." "That wasn't your fault, Shiro," Keith absolved him, not wanting him to carry any of the responsibility for anything that had happened to him. "And what happened to Lance isn't yours," Shiro said, his words coming down like a physical blow. Keith felt his soul squeezing closed, knowing that Shiro had a point, but still feeling somehow that for him it was different. Red covered him in warm truth, reminding him that she was still there, a participant in the conversation. "Listen to him," she was saying. "It only feels different because you think your life has less value than," she was saying. "It only feels different because you think your life has less value than the ones you love. It does not. It is the same." "I don't like it," Shiro said, unable to hear red in Keith's mind. "Every time you suit up, every time you get in that lion, it's all I can do to watch you go, knowing that you might not come back, that I might not be able to protect you. So don't you dare say I don't understand." "I'm sorry, Shiro," Keith apologized. Not the way he'd apologized to Allura. That had been empty. This time he meant it. "I didn't know." Shiro was standing now, offering a hand to pull Keith up beside him, into an embrace. "I didn't want you to know," Shiro confessed, confusing Keith. He pulled back, hands on Keith's shoulders, a mentor's grip. "Things you can do, Keith, they're astonishing. The way you've control, or precision. You're like a blade, if that makes sense. And if I were to blunt that sharpness that you have, if I were to introduce any doubt, no, can't happen. What you do, there's no room for error. So I put aside my worry, do you understand? I shut it down, and just pour belief into you. I don't ever want any weakness of mine to cost you any of your strength. Sometimes it's the only way I can help you." Keith looked to the ground, not sure what to say, still ashamed that none of this had ever crossed his mind before. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty," Shiro told him, sensitive to all of Keith's moods. "I'm telling you because it's something you're going to have to learn to do. You keep saying you failed Lance when you were in the canyon, but you didn't." "But Keith started to protest, but Shiro didn't let him get very far. "Didn't you stay with him? Didn't you tell him he could do it? That he was going to get out of there? That you weren't going to leave him because he was part of the team? Weren't those your words?" "Well, yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Look, I'm happy for you. You don't even know how happy I am for you, but you cannot always be there. And this is the best advice I can give to you. He needs your faith most. He needs your support. It's the best protection you can offer, trust me." Keith gathered his strength to make eye contact, still standing small under Shiro's hands. There was so much power and conviction in Shiro's face, and in that instant Keith knew it was true. He realized that he almost never worried about Shiro going into danger. They worked together as a team. They were great partners, and now he understood that part of the reason behind their performance was the missing fear. He trusted Shiro's skill, so there was no need to try and accommodate for the lack of it. "You're right, and accommodate for the lack of it." "You're right," he admitted, nodding slowly. Shiro smiled. He was usually right. They both knew it. "Hey guys? Shiro?" Lance's voice was hesitant at the entrance of the hangar. "Can I come in now?" Keith raised an eyebrow at Shiro. Lance had been waiting out in the hallway all this time? Red prodded his heart again, opening it a little more. It filled with warmth. "We're done," Shiro called, giving Lance permission to join them. Keith pressed his hands over his face, internalizing what Shiro had told him as Lance hurried to his side. Keith could see in his movements how difficult it had been for him to stay out there, doing his best to be patient. Another little current of guilt ran along Keith's back for running away from him. "Keith, you okay?" Lance asked before he'd come to a stop, reaching out to grab his hands. Shiro stepped away to give them room, expectant expression. "Yeah," Keith answered, his tone way too moody. But it just now hit him what he'd actually done. "Sorry, I wasn't running away from you. Words were so complicated sometimes. Dude, it's okay. I get it. That planet is like your kryptonite or something. Look, Lance," Keith went on, not quite ready to be forgiven. "I'm really not good at everything. I'm gonna screw up a lot." Lance bent down to make Keith look at him, smiling, affectionate, and Keith could tell that he could hear what he wasn't saying. "Forgive me. Be patient with me. Give me another chance." "That's okay, Keith. Lance assured him, putting pressure on his hands, firming the connection. I know what I'm signing up for. Besides, a playful glint sparked in his eye. You can make it up to me later. You can make it up to me later. Relief burst inside Keith so hard that he felt he had no choice but to dart forward and kiss Lance again, forgetting that Shiro was still standing right next to them. The way Lance responded, he'd forgotten too. For his part, Shiro stood quietly observing, letting them do as they pleased, but they separated quickly as soon as Pidge's surprised shriek filled the hangar. Keith folded his arms, noticing that Lance was doing the same thing, as the rest of the team came in. "Were you all waiting in the hall?" Keith hissed under his breath to Lance. "We were worried about you," came the answer. "When did this happen?" Pidge demanded, gesturing at the red and blue paladin standing in front of her. Keith couldn't help but smile. This wasn't exactly how he'd meant to let everyone know. "I mean, congratulations and all that, but were you going to tell us?" "Sure, we were leading up to it," Lance defended them. And you owe me money," Hunk told her. No," Pidge denied. "Terms were they had to get together without help. There's no way they figured it out by themselves. Deal is void." "But you were the one dropping hints," Hunk argued, "which means you cheated, which means you still owe me." "But more to the problem at hand," Alora cut in, physically stepping forward between them. Keith sighed. He'd been enjoying watching that. "Have we come to a conclusion about Malaya?" Lance put his hand on Keith's arm in support, and Keith looked at him gratefully. He felt Shiro still standing behind him, remembered all that he'd said. He stood up straight, facing Lance. "What do you think we should do?" he asked Lance, startling him. He wasn't used to being asked for his opinion, wasn't accustomed to being put on the spot for advice, but things were changing all the time. Lance was a strategist. They should ask him more often, even question. "Well," Lance began hesitantly, and Keith could tell that he was worried about his real feelings on the matter, now that he'd seen how strongly Keith felt about the situation. That wasn't good. He needed to feel safe saying what he thought, even if they disagreed. "You think we should do it?" Keith read the answer in the hesitation, trying his hardest to keep anything that might sound like judgment out of his voice. "Pidge is never wrong," Lance justified. "And like she says, we wouldn't have to touch down, and it would take less than an hour. And I can't help thinking, what if it were Earth? There were people down there. I mean, there are people down there. You're right, Keith, we can't save them all. But I think we can save this one. I think it's worth a shot." "Okay," Keith heard himself agree. He hadn't been the only one to suffer on Malaya, and if Lance could overcome his fear and doubt to take one... "I'll cover you," because the Blue Lion had to go first, down into the dark. "It's going to be all right. It has to be." "Thank you," Alora said, breaking into the moment, her tone jubilant. "I think this is the right choice." Keith still wasn't sure about that. There was still a whole lot that could go wrong with this, but the decision was made, and he was going to follow through. The room began to empty, Coran and Alora returning to the bridge, intent on steering the castle toward the dormant planet. Pidge and Hunk followed them, still bickering about the particulars of their bet. Shiro placed a hand on Keith's and Lance's shoulders. "You guys got this," he assured them, and Keith could feel it now, feel the steadiness of Shiro's belief like a force field surrounding them. "Suit up." "Thanks, Shiro," Keith told him as he passed, receiving a proud nod in return. "I'll see you down there," Lance said, looking slightly less enthusiastic now that the decision had been reached and they knew for sure that they were doing this. "You gonna be all right?" "Yeah," Keith said, wanting to believe it. "Are you?" "For sure. But if I do get into trouble, my badass boyfriend will totally jump off a cliff to rescue me, right?" Keith knew it was a joke, but he felt all the blood drain out of his face anyway. "Please, God, don't make me do that," he pleaded. "I will, but..." Lance punched him gently in the arm, and Keith used the contact to grab him, hugging him tight, closing his eyes. "I would," he said again, knowing it was true. Even though it freaked him out, He knew he would do whatever he had to if Lance needed him. But what Lance needed most, more than knowing Keith would save him, was the belief that it wasn't necessary, because he wouldn't need saving. But I won't have to. I won't have to. He let Lance go, physically. Emotionally, he still felt that they were together, holding each other tight. He saw a determination in Lance's face, a pride, and his fear lessened. "Let's do this," he invited, but then had a thought that paused him. "Oh, but first I have to get something from Pidge." He started heading toward the bridge, Lance right behind him, confused. "What?" he asked. "That stupid beetle," Keith said. "After we fix the planet, we are putting it back where it came from. I do not need a souvenir." "Sounds good," Lance agreed. Keith waited a moment to let Lance catch up to him, taking his wrist possessively, then reconsidered and joined hands instead. It did feel good. Different, but better. Level.